In this video, I'm going to walk through the creation of another plugin for Unmanic. This video will expand on the things I covered in the previous video. If you haven't watched that previous video, I suggest you go first watch that to better understand the basics of creating a plugin, and then come back to this one. In this video, I'm going to create a plugin that will add the ability to blacklist paths during the library scanner. The end result of this would give us the ability to specify a file or directory name, and the library scanner will ignore those. Today I'm going to be creating the plugin with VS Code, and I have Unmanic installed with pip. I'm going to start up Unmanic and then open it in my browser. If we go over to, some prerequisites before we get started. To develop it, you'll need to have your Unmanic logged in. I don't currently have any plugins installed. We go to the settings. I've got my paths set up with my development library path. I'm only going to use one worker, disabled the watcher, setting the library scan schedule to a really high number. That way I can only rely on manually initiated scans and not have to worry about it automatically doing its thing. Disable the library scan on start and enable debugging. For the rest of it, it doesn't really matter for this particular plugin, so I'm just going to show you what I've got, but in reality it doesn't matter. Cool. So if we go back to the dashboard, to get started, I'm going to open another terminal window here. I'm going to start off by opening the Manage Plugins CLI for Unmanic. As you can see here, if we list installed plugins, I've got nothing installed. Let's create a new plugin. I'm going to call this plugin Path Ignore. When we create our plugin IDs, you see here I've just left a space in there. That's an illegal character, but the Unmanic CLI will figure it out when it goes to create it. Create a name. As you can see, not yet. We're going to create a library management file test. As you can see here, we've created a path ignore plugin ID, and it's created the folder up here. When you create a plugin, just keep in mind that this creates it inside. If I exit the CLI, you'll see my current path is in my home directory under .unmanic and /plugins. That's where you want to go. That's where it will create it. But if we come over to the documentation, it'll tell us that as well. When we go to writing plugins, create a new plugin, you'll see that's where it creates it. So we go back into the CLI. Now if we list installed plugins, you'll see that it's there, just like before in the previous video. I'm going to start off by filling in some additional info about this plugin. So I'm going to be the author. I'll fill in the description later. Always a good idea to put in some useful tags, something like that. Now, in the previous video, we created a post-processor plugin. This one, we're creating a library management file test plugin. If we go to the plugin runners in the documentation, that's the top one here, you can see that this plugin runner will be run or executed during the library scan, and it tests the file to see whether or not it should be added as a task. This should be a pretty easy plugin to create. All we're going to actually do here is write some regex that we can configure within the web UI, and if it scans a file, and then it will match it against that regex, and if it matches, it will ignore it and tell the Unmanic process not to add it to the task list. So we're going to start off by creating some settings for this. So we're going to need one thing, I believe. We're going to need a string to check for patterns. In our runner, let's fetch those settings. Oops. And from there, fetch the string that has been saved. So we'll call this regex. Right. In this particular plugin runner, we are given these three pieces of data. We've been given the path, which is a string, which is the full path, the absolute path to that particular file. We've got a list of issues that have currently been picked up by the time it runs this plugin runner. There may be other plugins or the Unmanic process itself, it may have picked up issues as to why that particular file should not be processed. Those issues will be added to an array. And the last thing that we will have is a add file depending tasks boolean value, true or false, whether or not it should already be added. And what we're going to do with this plugin is we're going to match it against our regex, and if it does match, we're just going to set this particular value to false and return it. So to get started, what we're going to do is focus on getting the settings part done so we can add a list of regex strings, and then we're going to come back and finish writing the plugin runner. If you go over to the Unmanic settings, click on plugins, open up the plugin that you've created. It's cached something, hang on. You'll see that our options, because we've created a setting with a string, the options there is a text input. Now that's not really helpful to us because we want to be able to add in multiple lines. If we go over to the documentation for Unmanic and you go down to accessing plugin settings, you'll see right at the bottom, well, at the moment at the bottom, there's actually the ability to expand upon exactly this. You can expand upon the form settings. So what we're going to do is copy that into our settings class, and you know what, we'll go like that. And what this will do is, instead of it being a input, if we inspect this, you'll see it's an input. Now if we save this and come back here and reload it, you'll see that it's now actually a text area input. And this means that we can start adding in multiple lines. And this is going to be really useful because what we actually wanted to achieve here is having multiple lines of regex strings. So now that we've got that, we now need to update that because I changed that to a capital P. Now we're able to actually fetch those settings. So if I was to save that and then run this test installed plugins, you can see that we're actually saving that, and also over here under the settings JSON you can see that we're actually saving these strings. So how do we pull that data out? we want to split those lines into an array, loop over it. We want to be able to handle white space. Right, so let's do that. If not regex pattern, then continue. Let's compile some regex. We're going to need to import regex. Pass it through our string, and then do a search on it. How we do this? If fat fingers. So what we're doing here is we're checking to see whether or not path contains the compiled regex, and if it does, then we want to manipulate our data before we return it at the bottom here. So we want to basically pass that back as false. False. Alright. And that's pretty much it. At this point in time, if I actually start writing some regex in here, I will be able to actually use this plugin. So let's go to a thing and create some regex. Let's say we want to ignore a path that has dot ignore as the directory. We would want to write something like dot no comment dot ignore, and then whatever else after that. So if we come take that regex now, put it as part of our patterns, click save, put it over here now as a regex. We were to print and we run the test, you can see that it's fetched that. It will, well, it's already compiled, it didn't complain about compiling that, and it ran a search of that against a path. Let's find out what our path is. Let's actually be smart about this. We can print out the path that we're using to test, so we're using that to test. Let's copy that into here for another piece of regex. Let's print out we test it, we see it didn't find it. So basically under these conditions, this plugin would let this file go through and be added to the task list. So let's create some regex that will ignore it. Let's say we want to ignore anything that's in the directory named library. Why? I don't know. Alright, so that regex now grabs that, drop that down a line, save. Look at that, we'll see that it's added in the settings JSON. And if we go back to test, you'll see that it has compared it against both those two regexes, and the second one, it was found. So our plugin is working. So with that, we've been able to test that it actually works. Right, the next thing that we need to do is with a library management file test plugin runner, there's also the issues to be sent back. There's a note down the bottom. You can just append a string, however, so this will appear in the logs, right? I would recommend appending a dictionary like this when you mark something as not to be added. Let's fix that up. Call this, what's the name of it? Path ignore. And because path regex pattern because second path data path. Sweet. So now we're not only going to just say no, but we're also going to pass back a message that will appear on the logs as to why we're saying no, which is pretty helpful if you're ever debugging later on. Right, well that was pretty damn easy. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to upload this into the official repository shortly, and hopefully, I guess the main things that I wanted to point out with this is you can actually expand on the form settings that appear in Unmanic here, so you can actually manipulate them. There's a few other ones. Have a read through the documentation to see what other plugin settings are available. There are a couple of other options of a select drop down. You can also set the label. So for example, if we wanted to change our label here, you can go label now. If we were to refresh this, go into here, you'll see that the label has been overwritten. So have a read through the documentation. There's quite a lot you can do with this, but yeah, that's pretty much it. I hope this plugin is useful for people, and see what happens for the next one.